Have you ever entered a place that felt like breathing? Where the air seemed thicker, as if every wall was watching your movements? I did. And that night, I realized that not all secrets die with those who keep them. The case of the locked room began as a common investigation. A body, a door locked from the inside, no way out. But I soon realized that the real mystery wasn't how the crime happened, but why. I'm John Spencer, an investigator for over 20 years. I've seen it all: crimes of passion, political manipulation, even false miracles that ended in tragedy. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what I found in that old building downtown. A place where time stopped at 2:17 a.m. and logic decided to take a vacation. Some would call it chance, others a curse. I prefer to call it a mind trap, because the more I investigated, the more I realized that the locked room wasn't the real prison. The prison was inside people, and perhaps inside me too. But before I tell you what really happened that night, tell me one thing. Where are you watching this video from? I want to know if I've ever investigated any cases near your neighborhood, because, believe me, the world is smaller than it seems. It was raining, as if the heavens had decided to wash the city of its sins. The streetlights flickered, and the sound of thunder mingled with the distant echo of sirens. I parked my car in front of the old building, with its worn facade, where time seemed to have stood still. The janitor, his face pale, simply pointed to the third floor without saying a word. I climbed the stairs, smelling the metallic scent of mystery, the kind of aroma truth often leaves behind when it tries to hide. The room was locked from the inside. No windows, no cracks, just silence. I donned my gloves and asked the forensic expert to carefully break down the door. As soon as I entered, I felt a chill that wasn't coming from the rain outside. The body lay on the floor, perfectly positioned, with no signs of a struggle. It seemed the man had simply decided. But bodies rarely make choices. I took a few steps, taking in every detail. The antique furniture, the worn carpet, the clock stuck at 2:17. Everything there told a story, but none of it made sense. It was as if the room itself was lying to me. And I've learned, after so many years, that when the setting seems too calm, it's because it's hiding something big. I leaned against the doorframe and took a deep breath. The rain continued to pound the city, and the sound of the drops hitting the glass reminded me of an insistent knock, almost a warning. In that instant, I knew this would be no ordinary incident. And maybe, just maybe, this room held many more secrets than it seemed. While the experts did their work, I strolled down the narrow hallway. The peeling walls bore ancient marks, almost like scars. I discovered that the building had belonged to the Monteverdi family, a name that still resonated in the city's power circles, people who mixed politics, money, and secrets. In the 1940s, this place was the scene of lavish parties, fueled by champagne, promises, and conspiracies. Now, only the echoes of what once was power remained. As I delved deeper into the archives, I realized this family had more enemies than trophies: corruption, missing documents, accidental deaths. The kind of coincidences that keep any investigator awake at night. It was curious how, decades later, the building still exuded that heavy aura, as if the walls had learned to remain silent. Some longtime residents commented that they could sometimes hear footsteps upstairs, even when no one was living there. Others swore the lights always flickered at the same time, 2:17 a.m. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in this work, I learned that the supernatural is often just a logic we don't yet understand. As I stared at the shuttered windows, I wondered if this recent crime was just an echo of the past, or if the past had decided to collect its debt. Either way, something told me the answers lay hidden there, beneath layers of history and dust. As soon as I entered the room, the silence hit me hard. It was a kind of silence that doesn't just silence sound, it fills the air, heavy, almost alive. The musty smell mingled with an expensive perfume, the kind that lingers even after the wearer has left. This contrast disturbed me. It was as if two worlds had met there, luxury and oblivion. And in between them, the body that seemed to be in a forced sleep. I noticed the thick curtains, the creaking wooden floor beneath my footsteps, and that strange feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. In years of investigation, I'd learned to listen to what the environment was trying to tell me. And in that room, everything whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The stopped clock, the nearly invisible marks on the carpet, the broken glass near the chair. Every detail screamed a truth that wasn't yet ready to be heard. I grabbed my notebook and began to write, not what I saw, but what I felt. Sometimes it's what escapes logic that solves a case. As I was writing, a cracking sound came from the corner of the room. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The air seemed to vibrate for a moment, as if something had moved without permission. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the window was sealed, and wind doesn't enter where there are no gaps. The room seemed to have been plucked from another era. Dark wood furniture, polished enough to reflect my weary expression, contrasted with the dust accumulated in the corners. In the center sat a sturdy table, marked by scratches and cigarette burns, as if time had tried to erase traces of conversations that should never have taken place. The window, covered with old boards, had remained sealed for decades, preventing any view from outside or inside. I walked over to the antique clock hanging on the wall. The hands, stopped at 2:17, seemed to mock the rush of life outside. Times like these are often more than mere coincidence. They're the exact moment something stops, a heart, a secret, a truth. The non-existent ticking gave me the feeling that time, inside that room, had given up on moving forward. I ran my fingers over a dust-covered bookshelf. There were thick, hardcover books, reeking of old legal theories and cheap philosophy. On the floor, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, 2 glasses, one intact, the other broken. Everything was carefully arranged, almost theatrical. No killer does this without a purpose. I knelt by the fireplace and noticed small, fresh ashes, still warm. Someone had been there shortly before me, burning something that shouldn't have been there. It was then that I realized the set wasn't just frozen, it was staged, and the author of this play, wherever he was, still had control of the story. The body on the floor belonged to Arthur Vasconcelos, a name that, until then, had rang loudly in the halls of justice. A renowned lawyer, famous for freeing men from prison whom no one else would dare defend. A powerful, dangerous person, the kind who paid dearly to keep their secrets well guarded. Irony of fate, now he was the one who needed someone to defend him. But his silence was absolute. Arthur's face still maintained a strangely serene expression. No sign of a struggle, not a scratch. His expensive, impeccable suit contrasted with the coldness of the floor where he rested. In his right hand, he held a gold pen. In his left, a partially torn envelope with a seal I'd never seen before. It was as if he tried to write something and been interrupted. I researched his record. Political blackmail, evidence manipulation, bribery. The kind of man who knew too much, and who probably messed with people who preferred to remain in the shadows. Curiously, none of his clients attended the hastily organized preliminary wake. And when powerful people remain silent, it's because fear came before guilt. I looked at the body once more and wondered, was he paying for the sins of others or his own? A dangerous question, one that often drags the investigator along with the victim. But I was already too involved to back down. and something in that torn envelope seemed to scream my name, begging to be opened. The first thing I learned in investigations is that everything has an entrance and an exit. Everything. But here, it seemed as if even logic had given up. The door was locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. The windows, all sealed with weathered wood and ancient nails, impossible to remove without leaving marks. Not even the fireplace flue offered a way out. It was as if the killer had evaporated into thin air. I examined every corner of the room, trying to find a mistake, a detail, a tiny crack that might betray a trick. Nothing. No sign of escape, no footprints, not even dust displaced in unlikely places. The case defied the laws of physics and, even more so, patience. The experts looked at me as if they expected me to explain the impossible. And, well, maybe that was exactly what I needed to do. I sat in front of the door and stared at it for a few minutes, silent. Sometimes the answers lie not in what we see, but in what we ignore. What if the killer hadn't left? The thought flashed through me, but I quickly dismissed it. There was nowhere to hide there, or was there? I took out my notebook and wrote 3 words. Nothing is by chance. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I could hear, almost like a whisper, the sound of the lock echoing in my mind. That metallic click seemed to say something, and I didn't yet know what. But I would learn, even if it meant dismantling every secret in this room, piece by piece. It was a sharp crack that caught my attention. In the corner, near the table, lay a glass broken into 3 irregular pieces. The glass's shine reflected the cold light from the lamp, as if it still held the last vestige of an unspoken truth. I crouched down and, with the help of tweezers, noticed a faint whitish residue clinging to the edges. Nothing unusual, nothing accidental. An expert approached, and I simply said, "Test this, and quickly." As he gathered the material, I stared at the glass. It had been dropped, not thrown. This spoke volumes about the victim's final moments. There was no panic, no struggle, just a silent surrender, a movement too small to be a reaction, big enough to be a choice. And suddenly, that broken glass became the most eloquent point of the scene. I returned to my body and noticed something I'd missed before, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of powder on the sleeve of my jacket, the same color as the residue in the glass. Toxic? Hallucinogenic? Or something more elaborate, designed to fool the initial test? Whatever it was, whoever made that concoction knew chemistry and psychology. I stared at the glass for what seemed like a long time. It's funny how such a simple object can hold so much history. There, among those fragments, perhaps lay the first glimmer of logic in a case constructed to seem impossible. And I knew, from that moment on, the game had truly begun. As I observed each detail, something began to bother me. There was a theatrical precision in the arrangement of the objects. The body slumped almost elegantly, the broken glass in the exact spot one would expect to find it, the torn letter left in plain sight like a farewell note. Everything too perfect. And perfection at crime scenes is often the preferred disguise for lies. The first thing that came to mind was suicide, but I quickly dismissed it. The body didn't reveal the weight of the decision, only the coldness of someone who had been manipulated. Someone wanted us to believe in the illusion of a broken mind, but the staging was flawed in the details, and details always tell the truth. A man about to die rarely bothers to keep his surroundings clean. I picked up the torn envelope again and examined it under the light. No legible message, just the trace of firm, almost impatient handwriting. It looked more like an attempt to erase than to write. And instinctively I realized someone wanted us to consider suicide, but they also needed something to remain unfinished, like a challenge or a message. I took a deep breath. I've seen killers make mistakes out of pride, and victims leave their trails out of desperation. But this was a game of control. And if I was right, the true author of this play was still watching me, curious to see if I'd see through the ruse. And of course, I did. 3 names emerged in the first 24 hours. 3 stories that, at first glance, seemed to hold water, but only until the first deeper look. The ex-wife, Helena, a soft-spoken woman with a calculating gaze, swore she was on a spa trip to the coast. No witnesses, just a last-minute reservation. The kind of detail that sets off all the red lights in my mind. Then there was his partner, Eduardo Menezes, also a lawyer, and as ambitious as Arthur had been in life. He said he spent the night reviewing contracts in his office, but the doorman at his building confirmed that no one came or went. When truth and fear share the same body, lies are often the only refuge, and his was visibly uncomfortable. Finally, the journalist, Roberto Tavares, a man who thrived on scandals and public threats. He had promised to destroy Arthur's reputation in a bombshell story. However, at the time of the crime, he claimed to be in a bar, ironically, just a few blocks away. The bar owner confirmed it, but hesitated when speaking. Hesitation is the scent of lies. 3 suspects, 3 motives, 3 versions that didn't fit together. And the strangest thing was that they all seemed to know something they weren't willing to reveal. It was as if, somehow, each of them held a piece of the same secret, and no one wanted to be the first to spill it. I just needed to find out which of them still had their hands clean, if anyone there did. I stayed up late that night. The building was already asleep, and only the distant sound of rain still accompanied my thoughts. Reviewing my notes, I tried to piece together the puzzle, but something didn't add up. The nagging feeling that I wasn't alone began to bother me. At first, I thought it was just the wind rushing through the cracks in the ancient walls. But wind doesn't travel in circles. There were 3 steps, slow, precise, coming from inside the room itself. The same floor I had meticulously examined during the day now creaked under an invisible weight. I stopped breathing for a few seconds, listening to the silence settle back into the room, the kind of silence that screams. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my throat. "Is anyone there?" I asked. No answer. The flashlight cut through the darkness like a razor. I swept every corner, the fireplace, the bookshelf, the space behind the armchair. Nothing, no sign of anyone. And yet, the air felt different, heavy, electric, as if something had just happened. The sensation was so real, I had to check the door lock. It was still closed, from the inside. I sat back down, trying to reason. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe. But when I glanced at the wall clock, I felt a chill. The hands, which had been stuck at 2:17, now read 2:18. 1 minute. Just 1. And that was enough for me to realize this was about to cross the line between the logical and the inexplicable. The next morning I returned to the scene, determined to examine every detail with fresh eyes. The shy sun filtered through the cracks in the ceiling, revealing nuances that the night had hidden. As I studied the central table, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small notch in the wood at knee height. I knelt and ran my finger over the design. A triangle, within it an eye engraved with almost surgical precision. This wasn't decoration, it was a signature. I called the image expert and asked for a photo enlargement. The symbol was ancient, identical to that used by a discreet society that operated in the city in the 1940s and 1950s, the Order of the Vigil. They said it brought together politicians, jurists, and business people willing to manipulate judicial and economic decisions under the pretext of protecting the moral order. We never proved anything, but the rumors were as thick as the dust covering that room. That changed everything. Arthur Vasconcelos, the dead lawyer, had been investigating old contracts related to the construction of his own building. Perhaps he'd discovered something he shouldn't have. Perhaps the symbol was a reminder or a belated warning. And suddenly, the case was no longer just a murder. It became an open window to the past, and the wind blowing from it wasn't pleasant. I closed the notebook and stared at the drawing one last time. The eye, though motionless, seemed to be watching me. I had the distinct feeling that I, too, had been included in the game, and that, from that moment on, someone, somewhere, already knew too much about me. I returned to the table late in the afternoon, guided by a nagging intuition. That mark beneath the wood seemed to conceal more than it meant. I began tapping lightly on the sides, listening for the hollow sound that betrayed an empty space. With the tip of my pen, I loosened a hidden panel and found a hidden compartment, old but still functional. Inside, a small black-covered notebook, worn at the edges and bearing the damp smell of paper that had outlived time. The first few pages were illegible, smudged by the humidity. But on the last, the handwriting was firm, hurried, almost desperate. I read softly, "Room 47 exists. The truth is buried beneath the floorboards." I closed the diary and looked around, feeling the weight of those words seep into the air. The number intrigued me. There was no room 47 in that building, just 3 floors and 20 apartments. I held the diary over to a partially shaded window and let the light fall on the pages. There were small notes in the margins, names, dates, and a sequence of symbols similar to the triangle with the eye. It looked more like a map of connections than a personal record. Arthur was digging deep, perhaps deeper than he should have. That message about the floor started to hammer in my head. If something was buried, it needed to be found. And if Arthur knew too much, perhaps he tried to hide the evidence before they could silence him. I just had no idea that, in trying to uncover what he'd found, I was about to touch on something many would rather forget. That night, I was alone once more. The evidence piled up, but the more I tried to piece together the threads, the more they unraveled in my hands. I felt the weight of mental fatigue, the kind that distorts even the sound of thought itself. It was then that I noticed the clock on the wall, the same one, stuck at 2:17 since the beginning, now read 2:20. 3 minutes. None of them lived. I approached slowly, as if moving within a dream. I touched the glass, and it was cold, inert as always. No mechanism was working. The needle had simply changed. I stared at it for too long, somewhere between fascination and fear. I began to wonder if I was still the observer of the scene or part of it. The line between reality and imagination is often thinner than the blade of doubt. I picked up the diary again and tried to find rational explanations. Maybe the building's vibration, maybe a misperception caused by sleep. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more logic crumbled. The clock remained still, now back at 2:17, as if taunting me. You didn't see anything. And maybe I really hadn't. I sat on the cold floor, leaning against the wall. I closed my eyes and let the distant sounds of the city guide me back to reality, or what was left of it. Every investigator has a line between reason and the abyss, and I could have sworn mine was watching me back. And it was there, in the midst of this silent collapse, that I heard the crack of something under the floor, a reminder that the mystery still breathed. I spent the next few hours reviewing everything, every photo, every mark, every fragment. It was like trying to solve a problem that rewrote itself. The case had become a mathematical puzzle, the kind that defies even the very notion of space. How could someone enter and exit a locked room without leaving a single trace? The question seemed simple, but its echo was deafening. I drew the room's floor plan on paper. I analyzed angles, directions, measurements. I tested absurd hypotheses, one by one. And when they all failed, I started thinking outside the room, literally. The killer needn't have left if he'd never actually entered. The idea sounded insane, but logic is sometimes the preferred disguise for the impossible. As I pondered, I recalled the sound I'd heard in the early hours, the invisible footsteps, the clock ticking on its own. Perhaps the trick wasn't in the physical structure, but in the psychological. A murder designed to appear supernatural, designed to confuse, to delay. And, let's face it, it was working. I closed my eyes and visualized the scene again, in slow motion. Every object, every silence, every shadow. Then I realized something I'd missed before. The ashes in the fireplace weren't from burning wood, but from paper. What if someone had used that space not to enter or exit, but to hide the true vanishing point? Logic was breathing again, and with me, the hope of dismantling the trick. The report arrived 2 days later, raising more questions than answers. The toxicology report revealed a rare substance in the victim's blood, a compound that acted slowly, causing drowsiness, mental confusion, and a strange sense of obedience. It was as if the mind gave way before the body. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. Arthur was alive when the door was locked. He had closed it himself, of his own free will, or what was left of it. That changed everything. The killer didn't force his way in or flee. He simply led the victim through a psychological ritual planned with surgical precision. Manipulation, suggestion, mind control. The crime had ceased to be physical and had become intellectual, a game of minds, and Arthur had lost. I began to imagine the scene. Arthur sat, numb, believing himself in control, locking the door with his own hands, while someone, perhaps very close by, watched in silence. A simple gesture that sealed his fate. No noise, no struggle, just the sharp click of the lock, marking the exact moment of submission. I leaned against the wall, trying to absorb the weight of the discovery. The killer wasn't just clever. He was someone with a deep understanding of the human mind. And if he could convince a sane man to seal his own end, what else could he manipulate? Truth? Justice? Or even the investigator pursuing him? With the new result in hand, I began revisiting the evidence, like someone dismantling an optical illusion. Everything in that room, from the position of the body to the perfect lock, began to seem rehearsed. The more I observed, the more I realized that the real trick wasn't hiding the killer, it was fabricating a culprit. The crime itself was merely the backdrop to a larger scenario. I returned to the torn envelope and noticed something I'd missed before. The initials EM engraved in nearly invisible ink. Eduardo Menezes, the partner. The evidence subtly pointed to him, like someone leading the eye of a distracted audience. He was elegant, intelligent, and bold. The kind of man who'd have the skill to stage such a scenario, and the kind of enemy someone like Arthur would love to punish, even after death. Perhaps the real perpetrator used the victim's pride against her, unwittingly convincing her to participate in her own trap. Arthur believed he was staging something symbolic, a final act to protect a secret. And in the middle of it all, someone changed the script. They turned the simulation into murder and the partner into a scapegoat. When I realized it, I felt the familiar chill of the truth approaching. The killer wanted everyone to follow the obvious trail, and I was about to fall into the trap. But one thing didn't add up. If Eduardo was the target, why was the secret society symbol hidden under the table? The crime seemed to have two perpetrators, and one of them hadn't yet left the scene. I returned to the room with a different purpose, no longer to seek evidence, but to listen to what the walls had to say. The memory of the ashes in the fireplace haunted me, and there was something about that spot that wouldn't leave me alone. I touched the wooden panel with my fingertips and felt a slight vibration, almost imperceptible, but constant. I pushed harder, and a crack echoed through the room. The panel gave way. Behind it, a narrow corridor, covered in dust and memories. The flashlight's light revealed short steps descending into a stuffy space. The walls were stone, and ancient rust marks betrayed the use of metal gates. Historical documents would later confirm the building had been used as a clandestine crossing point during World War II, when businessmen and politicians exchanged information with foreign regimes. The so-called Order of the Vigil had deeper roots than I imagined. I followed the hallway cautiously, feeling the air grow colder. Downstairs, I found old boxes, burned papers, and, on an iron table, a golden key identical to the one on the door to the room. But what shocked me most was the inscription on one of the papers, a drawing of the same triangular symbol, followed by a phrase, "He who closes the door opens the way." In that instant, I understood the real trick. The door locked from the inside was part of the ritual. Arthur wasn't just being manipulated. He was fulfilling a secret tradition, a code inherited for decades. And if this passage existed, the killer didn't need magic to disappear, just history. I confronted Eduardo Menezes in his office. He tried to keep his gaze steady, but his voice betrayed his practiced calm. I showed him the photos of the hidden corridor and the golden key. For a few seconds, he said nothing, just a wry smile, the kind of reaction that comes not from guilt, but from the certainty that the game is over. "You don't understand, Spencer," he murmured. "Arthur was going to destroy everything. He needed to be contained." The cold tone of those words reminded me of the silence of the locked room. As he spoke, I noticed details that now screamed truth. The dust mark on the hem of his pants, consistent with the floor of the secret passage. The slight cut on his finger, likely made when removing the panel. Eduardo knew the building better than he let on. He had inherited old documents from the construction company responsible for the work. He not only knew about the passage, but used it to enter and exit without being seen. He planned everything with the precision of a watchmaker. He dosed Arthur with the compound, convinced him to lock the door, and waited for the effects to do the rest. Then he covered his tracks, reignited the old ritual, and left through the passage as if it were just another shadow from the past. A crime with a signature, but no trace. Until now. When I ordered his arrest, he just sighed. "You shouldn't have messed with that, Spencer. Some secrets sleep better when they're not found." Maybe he was right, but it was too late, and deep down I knew. He wasn't the only one awakened by this case. As the officers handcuffed him, Eduardo slowly turned to me. There was something strange in his gaze, not hatred, not fear, but understanding. "Arthur knew he was going to die, Spencer," he said, his voice firm, almost proud. "He wanted it." For a moment, I thought it was just another attempt to confuse the narrative, but the conviction in his words chilled me to the core. He continued, "It was the only way to reveal what we did. The truth needed a martyr." The silence that followed was almost physical. I thought about the diary, the phrase about the truth buried beneath the floorboards, and everything began to make sense. Arthur had discovered too much about the Order of the Vigil, and realizing he was surrounded, he decided to turn his death into testimony. He left the stage set, the symbol, the torn letter, all calculated so that the investigation would lead him to the corruption hidden for decades. Eduardo, even as the executioner, seemed more executioner than villain. He asked me to perform the ritual, to ensure the symbol returned to the light, he confessed. "You didn't arrest a murderer, Spencer. You arrested the messenger." His tone wasn't ironic, but resigned, and for a brief moment I didn't know what to feel. I left the building feeling like nothing was truly over. The cold wind hit my face, and the distant sound of a door slamming echoed inside my head. Perhaps Arthur had achieved what he wanted, to expose the truth. But the price had been too high. and deep down, I wasn't sure the truth truly wanted to be found. I closed the case report days later, but the feeling that something remained unsolved never left me. I spent nights rehashing every detail, every sentence spoken, every glance exchanged. There was nothing left to investigate, at least not officially. But certain stories insist on continuing, even after the final full stop. The building was sealed, the passage blocked, and Arthur Vasconcellos' name was discreetly erased from the news. The city chose to forget. I didn't. I wondered how many doors like that still existed out there, locked not by locks, but by fear. The kind of fear that shapes decisions, creates monsters, and justifies silence. Arthur didn't die just from knowing too much. He died because he decided to open what no one else dared touch. And deep down, part of me understood. One night, I passed the building again. The windows were still dark, but I swear I saw a faint light flicker behind those ancient boards. Maybe it was reflection, maybe memory, or maybe the past was still trying to tell me something. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the wind, before continuing on my way. As I walked, I quietly repeated something I learned too late. Sometimes the most locked doors aren't made of wood or iron, but of the human mind. And maybe, just maybe, some of them should never be opened. After so many years dealing with crimes, I've learned that the truth rarely arrives screaming. It whispers. Sometimes it hides between the lines, in pauses, in gestures no one notices. The locked room case taught me something I didn't learn in academia or reports. The human mind is capable of locking its own consciousness more efficiently than any lock. Arthur Vasconcellos believed he was controlling destiny, but it was destiny that guided him. And in the end, I realized that we all, at some point, lock ourselves inside, out of fear, pride, or regret. The problem is, we don't always have the courage to turn the key back. Every investigation, at its core, is a search for answers that explain the inexplicable. But the greatest discovery of this case was realizing that some doors only open when we change our perspective. The crime, the truth, the mystery, it all boils down to this: seeing beyond the surface. If this story made you think, or made you curious to know what else the world tries to hide, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are still many secrets out there, and I, John Spencer, intend to continue revealing each and every one of them.